Hey everyone, welcome back to another Angular tutorial. In our last video, we built the task list application using NgRx. Today we are taking a step further and adding a common real-world feature, which is user authentication, managed entirely using NgRx. We'll create a simple login logout feature where the user authentication status and username are stored right in our NgRx store. This will demonstrate how NgRx is incredibly useful not just for feature-specific state like tasks, but also for managing global state like authentication. We'll see how to dispatch login and logout actions, also how to use selectors to read the auth state and conditionally show some parts of our UI, specifically our this task list, based on whether the user is logged in or not. So if our user is logged in, we will show the task list component. If not, we won't show it. So let's get started. Okay, first thing first, just like with our task, we need to define the shape of our authentication state as well. For that, we will use our NgRx store. So what information do we really need to track all the changes in our authentication? For example, a simple use case we could think of is if a user is authenticated or not. And if the user is authenticated, then what is their username? So we can store this data in our NgRx store. So inside the src, in the app folder here, we will create a new folder. We will call it auth, okay? And inside the auth, we will create our auth file where we will define the structure of our authentication. So we'll call this auth.model.ts, okay? So here we'll say export interface and we want to define our auth state. So we'll call it auth state. So inside this, we will have is authenticated. Okay, and this would be a true or false value, so we'll say boolean. Okay, so this will check if the user is logged in or not. Another thing we are going to keep track of is our username. So what is the username? So it's a string or null, so we'll give it like this. Okay, so this is our interface for auth state, and it will have our username and it will have our is authenticated boolean. Okay, so we will store the username or null if the user is not logged in. Okay, and now what we'll do is we will define our initial state when our app loads. So we'll say here export constant initial state. Okay, so this initial state would be of type auth state, this one, and for this we will initialize it and we'll say is authenticated. In the beginning would be false, right, because initially the user is not logged in, so we'll give it false, and our other property, which username, will give it null. Okay, because username initially is empty. Okay, we are done with our interface. Next up is our actions. So you remember actions describe events which happens in our application. For example, in our authentication case, the key events are logging in and logging out, right? So these would be the two actions which we will define. So we will go into our auth folder here again and we will create a new file and we'll call it our actions file. So we'll say auth.actions.ts. Okay, inside this we can define both of our actions which our application does, right? Which is logging in the user and logging out the user. So first action for whenever user successfully logs in. So we'll say export constant login and we'll say it create action, as you know. And inside this we need to, inside the string, we need to first write our source of the action. So what is it? Auth. And here we need to write the type of the event. For example, this is our login, right? So we'll write login. And after this we need to pass our payload. So what payload we want to pass for login is a username, right? So we'll say here username, and username would be of type string. Okay, so this is the payload we'll pass as props here, and we'll just give the import here. Now this is our first action. So this action carries a payload which is the username, okay, of type string. Now we'll create our another action which would be our logout. So we'll say export constant logout, and this is the easy action. We'll say create action here, and same, this would be our auth, and we'll just put square brackets, and after this is a logout event, right, like this. Okay, and for this one we don't need a payload because this is just logout, that's it. So we define two actions using our create action. The first is login and another is logout. And the login action needs to know who logged in. So we use props to pass our payload, which is username, okay? And the logout action is simpler. It doesn't need anything. So we don't need to pass any extra data. So next step is to implement our most crucial part, which is reducer. So as you know, reducer, it's a pure function which takes our current state and the action associated with that, and it returns us with the new state. So it's the only place where our authentication state should actually change. So we'll quickly create our reducer file in our auth. So here I'll say auth.reducer.ts, and inside this we will define our authReducer. So we'll create our authReducer. For that we'll say export constant authReducer, and we will equate it to create reducer, which comes from our NgRx store. Okay, and inside this we will define our initial state first. So we'll start with the initial state, which we have already defined, which is initial auth state, this one, initial auth state. And after this we will handle our actions. So first action which we will handle is the login action. So we'll say on, we'll write the action here, which is login. Okay, it comes from our auth actions, and whenever a login action is called, we want to take the state and the username, okay, which we have passed through props. We want to open our arrow bracket, and inside this, whenever our login action occur, we want to return a new state object. So for that we will say return, okay, and for the new state object we will take our previous state. Okay, so what this will do is this will copy our existing properties and it will only change the properties which you want to change. In our case it's is authenticated here, okay, and we will set it as true. Okay, so we have set is authenticated property as true, and also we will pass our username. So we'll say username, this will be equals to the username which you passing through the props. Okay, so this will set our is authenticated as true, and this will give the username property which is coming from the action payload. Okay, now this is giving error because we need to import it from our store, and once we do this you can see the error is gone. Now we need to write the logic for our logout action. So after this, so we'll say on, whenever our logout action is called, we want to do the same thing. We want to take the state, and as we do not have any props with it, we'll directly open our arrow bracket, and inside this we will say return our initial state, which is basically false, and there is no user, right, because it's logged out. So initial auth state is this, is authenticated is false, username is null, so basically user is logged out. So if user clicks on logout action, then we want to return this state. Okay, easy. So selectors are nothing but they are functions which query the store and gives us some specific part of the state. For example, if we want the state for if the user is authenticated or not, or if we want to receive the state of if it's logged in or logged out. So for this we will have some selectors defined in our selector file. So we'll quickly go here and we'll create a new file and we'll call it auth.selectors, okay, .ts, as we'll have multiple selectors inside this file. So inside our selector, first we will create the feature selector for the auth, okay, for the auth state. So what we'll do is we'll say here export constant and we'll call it select auth state. So this will have the full auth state of our selector, and here we'll say create feature selector and this one. So here we will have our, this will be auth state, okay, and like this, and here we will define our key. So the auth string you see here, this must match our key which we will use to register our reducer later on, okay, as we also learned in the previous video. Now once we have done this, we have created our feature selector. Now we will create selectors for our is authenticated property, and other one I think we will need for our username. So if we want to get our username and if you want to know if the user is authenticated or not. So we'll say export constant, we'll say select is authenticated user, okay. So select is authenticated, this will be create selector, and inside this we will have our select auth state, right. So we'll say select auth state, so we'll use our feature selector here, and after this we will take the state which you want, so state of type auth state, and we will return here state dot is authenticated, because we just want the true or false value, right? If our user is authenticated or not. So with this selector, we'll get that. Okay, so after this, now we also want to get our username property, right, in our component. So we will create another selector and we'll call it select username. Okay, and again this will be create selector, and inside this we will have our select auth state. Okay, and from this time we want to get our username. So we'll say state of type auth state again, and we want to return our username this time. So we'll say state dot username. So what this will do is this will give us our username, which could be a string or it could be a null value. So first we used our create selector to get a reference to our entire auth state, okay, of our application. After that, we are getting specific auth state for our, if the user is authenticated or not, or what is our username. Okay, so now we are done with our selectors as well. So now our application has two slices of state. Okay, one is the auth state which we created now, and the other is our task state which we created in the previous video. So we need to update our overall application state into one state definition. So what we will do is we will create a app state file. So it will be our main app state. Okay, so inside the app here, we will create a app state file. So I'll call it app.state.ts. Okay, inside this we will have our app state. So we just need to define our interface for the app state. So we'll say export interface, and it would be our app state. Okay, like this. And what we'll do is we'll write both of our reducer state here. So one is for task reducer and other is for our auth. So first we'll write for the task. Okay, so we'll say task. Okay, task, and this would be of type task state, as we have already defined here. And the other one will be our auth. So we'll say auth, and this would be of type auth state. So like this. So now our app state, you can see it has a task property, okay, and it has a auth property. Both of them handling the task state reducer and the auth state reducer as well. Okay, now we need a way to combine our individual reducers from our task reducers and our app reducers into a single structure that our NgRx can use. So we do this with an action reducer map. So we use action reducer map whenever we have multiple reducers in our application and we want to manage multiple state. So for that, we will create an app reducer as well here. So we have got an app state, so we will create an app reducer. Okay, so here we'll say new file, which will be app.reducer.ts. Okay, so make sure you create this inside the root folder of our file. Okay, so here we'll combine all of our reducers into one single reducer map. So we have two keys, right? One is our task and one is our auth. So these keys must match what we have defined in our reducers. Okay, so I'll say here export constant, and we'll call it app reducer. And as I said, this is the action reducer which we use when we want to combine multiple reducer. So we'll say action reducer map. Okay, and this will have a state of app state. Okay, so which is basically both of our auth and our task, and they will initialize this as an object, and inside this we'll have our task. Okay, and this will be task reducer. Okay, and the other one we'll have is our auth. So auth will be our auth reducer. Okay, this one. So now this app reducer is an action reducer map. Okay, so it's an object where we have two keys, which is task and we have auth, which we have defined in our selectors. Okay, so you can see in auth selector we have got an auth key, and in our task selector we have a task key. So that should match exactly to our keys here, task and auth. Okay, so these keys actually tells NgRx which reducer manages which slice of the state, like task or auth. Okay, so now we are almost done with the setup. We just need to tell our main app module that it needs to use this combined app reducer now. Okay, so we'll go into our app.module file and we will modify our store.forRoot here. Okay, so you can see we previously registered our store module.forRoot under task at task reducer for our task application, but now we need to combine, so we'll just use the app reducer here. So we'll just remove it and we'll write here app reducer. Okay, now our NgRx knows how to manage both the state, which is our auth state and our task state. Alright, the NgRx setup is complete. Now let's hook this up to our user interface. So we will go into our app component file and we will connect this to our login and logout functionality. So let's get started. Okay, so we need to dispatch our login and logout actions which we have created. So for that we need to select our authentication state. So first what we will do is we will create observable, right, to get the data from the store. So we will say here, first we want to check if our user is authenticated or not. So we will say is authenticated here, and we will give it type observable as it's observable, and it will give us true or false. So it would be a type boolean. Okay, and we'll just give here an indefinite sign, and this is our is authenticated observable, okay, for our authentication state. So we need one more, which is our username, right, of type string, okay, or null, because it can be empty too. So now we are done with defining both of our observables, okay, for authentication store. Okay, so now next thing which we'll do is we need to inject our store from our app state. So we will say here store, and it will be of type app state here, okay, because now all of our data is coming from that one single action map reducer. So after this, so now to get the data in our observable, we need to use our select, okay. So we will say this dot is authenticated. So in our constructor, this is the method which will get called first. So inside this we'll initialize it with our data. So we'll say this dot store dot select, and here we will write our selector, okay, which will get us the data. So we'll say select is authenticated, okay. So this is the selector which we created, and same we will do for our username observable too. So we'll say username equals to this dot store dot select, same stuff, and this time it would be for our username. So we'll say select username. If you are getting confused, then these are the two selectors which we created in our auth selectors. See, select is authenticated and select username. These get us the selected state which we want in our app component, which is authentication and username, okay. So now with this, we can load our username and we can check if our username is authenticated or not. But before that, we will also add our methods for our login user and logout user, okay. So these are the methods through which we will send data from our component to our store, okay. So to update the store, this what we did was to get data from the store. So now we will declare our method which is login user, okay, and we'll define this method in our HTML. So for the logic, we will say, so here just for the demo purpose, I'll use a simple prompt. You can even use forms like how we used in other videos to get the data from the user. So I'll just use a basic form. I'll say constant name and I'll get a prompt here, okay, and the user will enter the name, and if it's correct, like if name exists, so we'll say if name, basically if it exists, then we can dispatch our login action. When we have form, we can have form validation. So we can say this dot store dot dispatch, and now we want to dispatch our action, which will again call our reducer and update our state. So we'll call our login action, which is auth.action, okay, and inside this we'll pass our username. So our username would be our name, okay, and we can say name.trim, so that would be better. So now we are passing our name here, okay, and we'll do same for our logout user as well. So logout user, this will just pass our logout dispatch action, okay. So we'll say this dot store dot dispatch, and we want to pass our logout action. So we'll say logout, and you can see it's coming from our auth. Okay, so now we are done with both of our methods, which is login and logout user, and also we are getting the data from our store. So now let's update the template so we can use these observables, okay. So inside the app component.html, so here we'll have some boilerplate code, and we'll have a h1 NgRx auth and task, and we will have a div here, okay, and inside the div we can have a ng container, okay, and the container we will only show if our user is authenticated, then only we want to show the content inside the container, okay. So I'll say ng if, okay, only if our user is authenticated. So I can say is authenticated, and I will use my async pipe, okay, to load the data. And if this is not the case, like if our user is not authenticated, then we will show our logged out content. So for that we'll have another ng template. So we will show logged out content, and we'll create this ng container again, okay. So logged out content, and basically if this is false, not true, then here after this ng container we'll have a ng template which will show the user, like asking them to log in, okay, and we will name it this logged out content, okay. So this is basic Angular. Now what we'll do is we can have here some boilerplate code to say user to log in, okay. So we'll have a p tag saying you are not logged in and please log in. So we will have button, and in the button we will have a click event, and which will call our login user method, which we already defined, and we'll call the button login. Okay, which makes sense. Now in our container, when user is actually authenticated, that time we will say user welcome back username. So we can say username, and obviously we need to use our async pipe, and we need to allow our user to log out as well. So for that we will have a button here saying logout. Okay, and calling our logout when the click event is called. So we'll say click, and we want to call our logout user here. Okay, so now we are actually done with our setup for our authentication. Now what we need to do is we only want to show our user the task list, the whole task list, only when user is authenticated. Otherwise we don't want to show it. So on this div I will say ngIf, okay, and only if user is authenticated I want to show it. So I'll say authenticated, and here I'll use my async pipe. Okay, so it will only show the whole task list if our user is authenticated, otherwise it won't show it. But if that is not the case, then we also want to show something to the user, right? At that time we will have another div, and here we will say ngIf if it's not authenticated, right? So like this, if it's not is authenticated, if it's false. Okay, so like this. Okay, so if this is false, then we want to show this, and we can say like please log in to see your task. Okay, so now we are done with all of our code. Only one thing left is here I can see that I need to have a else here. Okay, so it can show our this template. So now we can save it, and we can go to our application to see. You see it says you are not logged in, and we cannot see our task list. So please log in to see your task. So if we click on login, and it will ask me my username, I'll write Abhi, and you see it will say me welcome back Abhi, and now I can see my task. So I can add some task here, and our application is working as it should, like exactly. But it also allows us to now log out. And if I click on logout, I won't be able to see the task list again. So I'll have to log in again to see my task list. And if I click here, Abhi, and you will see all of the information which we had before is saved exactly like that. And our whole authentication state is working properly. So there you have it. We have successfully integrated a simple authentication state management into our Angular app using NgRx. So we created a dedicated state slice for our auth. For that we defined actions, reducers, and selectors, and we use that state to conditionally render this part of our application. Okay, so this demonstrates how NgRx isn't just for managing basic list of data, but it's also perfect for handling global application state like this, where we have to manage user authentication, and we can also use it to manage themes for different kind of users. So I hope this video was clear and helpful. If you learned something, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more Angular content like this. I will see you guys in the next video.